The Glenview Manor Ballroom was the kind of place I never imagined I'd find myself in. A grand, glittering venue filled with the rich and powerful, the type of people who shook hands while calculating how to climb higher. The chandeliers sparkled, the soft murmur of classical music set the mood, and waiters drifted between conversations, offering champagne on silver trays. It was the Glenwood Preparatory School fundraiser, an event Amelia couldn't miss and one I couldn't care less about. Amelia Carter, my wife of 10 years, fit right in. She was radiant, as always, in a sleek black gown that clung to her curves. Her laugh carried across the room like a melody, drawing people to her as effortlessly as a flame draws moths. She had this confidence, this ability to command attention, that always left me wondering how she had ended up with someone like me. A humble literature teacher in a patched-up suit, a stark contrast to her high-powered real estate career and polished elegance. I clung to my champagne flute like a lifeline. These events weren't my scene. Pretentious smiles, endless small talk, and the invisible pecking order that defined these gatherings, it all felt suffocating. Amelia, though, thrived in this world. She was in her element, chatting up donors and making connections, her hand occasionally brushing my arm as if to remind me I was part of her carefully curated image. "Ethan," she said with a gentle squeeze of my arm, "just smile. You don't need to say much. Let me handle it, okay?" I nodded, forcing a tight smile. That's when Gregory Sinclair, the headmaster of Glenwood Prep, made his entrance. The man had an aura about him, a mix of charm and arrogance that filled the room before he even spoke. Standing over 6 feet tall with a confident grin and a tailored suit that screamed wealth, he seemed like the kind of guy who'd never known failure. Amelia lit up as he approached us, her smile widening in a way that I couldn't quite ignore. "Mr. Carter," he greeted me, shaking my hand firmly before turning to Amelia. "And Mrs. Carter. What a pleasure." His gaze lingered on her a second too long. I noticed, but I doubted Amelia did. She was too busy charming him, complimenting his leadership and expressing her admiration for the school's ambitious expansion plans. I stood there, awkwardly silent, as they exchanged pleasantries. Then came the invitation. Sinclair leaned in slightly, his tone dropping into something almost conspiratorial. "You know, Amelia, we could really use someone with your expertise on our leadership team. Glenwood needs innovative minds." I expected Amelia to deflect, but instead, she tilted her head and laughed softly. "I'd love to discuss that further." Something in her voice felt different. It wasn't the usual professional politeness I'd heard her use in meetings. It was warmer, more inviting. Sinclair must have noticed it too, because his eyes glinted with interest. As the night wore on, Sinclair pulled me aside, his tone dropping to something almost predatory. "You've got a remarkable wife, Ethan," he said. "She's impressive. A woman like her could do great things here." It wasn't a compliment. It was a challenge. I looked for Amelia after that, uneasy but unsure why. I spotted her near the grand staircase, talking animatedly with Sinclair. When he suggested they continue their conversation upstairs, she hesitated, just for a moment, before following him. Her laugh echoed softly as they disappeared from sight. I stood frozen, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. She didn't even look back. That moment in the ballroom, it was like watching a glass slip off a counter in slow motion. I knew it was going to shatter, but I couldn't move to stop it. The image of Amelia trailing behind Sinclair stayed burned in my mind for the rest of the night. I told myself she was just networking, that I was being paranoid. Yet, a voice in the back of my head kept asking, why didn't she even hesitate? I stayed in the ballroom for another hour, forcing polite smiles and nods as people made small talk. I couldn't focus on their words. My eyes kept darting to the staircase, hoping to see Amelia returning, laughing off the whole thing as a misunderstanding. She didn't. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I excused myself, weaving through the crowd and heading upstairs. My heart pounded as I climbed the steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. The upstairs hallways were quieter, lined with closed doors and the faint hum of distant voices. I walked slowly, trying not to let my mind spiral. Then I heard it, a muffled laugh. Amelia's laugh. It came from behind one of the closed doors. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My pulse thundered in my ears. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I backed away, turning and heading for the exit. The ride home with Amelia was silent. She didn't even bother explaining why she'd been gone so long, and I didn't ask. Part of me was afraid of the answer. The next few days passed in a haze. Amelia acted as if nothing had happened. She went about her routine, answering work calls, hosting client meetings, planning her next big deal. But something had shifted. She seemed lighter, like she was carrying a secret that gave her energy. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I'd misinterpreted everything. Maybe it was just my insecurities, the nagging fear that I wasn't enough for her. Then, on Thursday, I came across her phone on the kitchen counter. Amelia was in the shower, and her ringtone buzzed against the marble surface. I glanced at the screen. A text from Gregory Sinclair. I shouldn't have looked. I know that. But I couldn't stop myself. I tapped the message, and what I saw made my stomach churn. Last night was unforgettable. Let's plan the next one soon. The words blurred as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. My hands shook as I locked the phone and set it back on the counter, just as Amelia's footsteps padded down the stairs. Who was texting? She asked casually, wrapping her robe tighter around herself. I shrugged, forcing a neutral tone. Work stuff, I think. Your phone buzzed. She smiled and picked it up, her eyes flicking to the screen. For the briefest moment, her expression faltered, like she knew I'd seen it. But she recovered quickly, tucking the phone into her pocket and changing the subject. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cracks in our marriage, the things I'd ignored or explained away over the years, were suddenly glaring. The late nights at work, the unexplained absences, the moments when she seemed distracted or distant, all of it clicked into place. But it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the realization that I'd been blind to it for so long, convincing myself that everything was fine. By Saturday, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. Amelia was in the living room, sipping coffee and scrolling through her tablet. I sat down across from her, my hands gripping the edge of the coffee table. We need to talk, I said. She looked up, her brow furrowing. About what? I hesitated, searching her face for any sign of guilt or remorse. Instead, she looked annoyed, like she didn't have time for this conversation. About Sinclair, I said finally. And what happened at the fundraiser? Her expression hardened. What are you accusing me of, Ethan? I'm not accusing you of anything, I said, though my voice betrayed my anger. I need to know the truth. Did something happen between you two? She set her coffee cup down with a clink, crossing her arms. That's ridiculous. He's a professional contact. I was networking. Networking doesn't usually involve disappearing upstairs for an hour, I shot back. Her eyes flashed, and for a moment, I thought she was going to come clean. But instead, she doubled down. You're being paranoid, she said coldly. You've always been insecure about my career, about the fact that I'm more successful than you. This is just another excuse for you to try to control me. Her words stung, but I refused to back down. It's not about your career, Amelia. It's about trust. And right now, I don't trust you. She stood abruptly, grabbing her tablet and coffee. I don't have to listen to this, she said, storming out of the room. As the door slammed behind her, I sat there, staring at the empty space where she'd been. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what I was losing. Not just my wife, but the version of her I'd loved, the life we'd built together. And I knew this was just the beginning. The tension in the house became unbearable after that conversation. Amelia avoided me, throwing herself into work even more than usual. Late-night calls, business trips, meetings that ran long, I stopped questioning them. The more I asked, the angrier she became, accusing me of being controlling or worse, insecure. I hated that word. It wasn't insecurity. It was clarity. One night, I was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV but not really watching. My mind was stuck on that text from Sinclair. Unforgettable. The word gnawed at me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her following him up those stairs. That's when an idea hit me. I didn't want to believe it had come to this, but I needed proof. The guessing, the lying, it was eating me alive. I grabbed my laptop and started researching. A quick search led me to a private investigator agency in town. The next day, I met with a man named Harris, a middle-aged guy with a no-nonsense demeanor and a voice like gravel. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just handed me a form, laid out his fees, and told me what he needed to get started. I gave him a picture of Amelia, her work schedule, and the license plate of her car. Discreet, right? I asked as I handed over the information. He smirked. Discretion's my middle name. The waiting was the hardest part. Days turned into a week, and Harris didn't call. Amelia was out more than ever. She claimed it was for work, but I could feel the distance between us growing wider. Every time she left, I wondered if she was meeting Sinclair, or someone else. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, Harris called. His voice was calm, professional, but the weight of what he said hit me like a truck. "I have something for you," he said. "It's substantial." We met at his office. The manila folder he handed me felt heavier than it should have been. I didn't open it right away. "What am I looking at here?" I asked, my voice dry and cracking. "Photos, timestamps, locations," Harris said. "She met Sinclair 3 times over the past week. Once at a hotel downtown. Twice at his office after hours." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Anything else?" Harris hesitated, his rough exterior softening just slightly. "There's no question, Ethan. It's an affair." I drove home in silence, the folder sitting on the passenger seat like a bomb ready to go off. Part of me didn't want to open it. If I didn't look, maybe I could pretend it wasn't real. But as soon as I pulled into the driveway, I tore into the envelope. The photos were damning. Amelia walking into the hotel with Sinclair, laughing as they disappeared through the doors. A shot of them through the window of his office, too close for a work meeting. And the worst one, a grainy image of them kissing in the parking lot, her hand lingering on his chest. I stared at the photos for what felt like hours. The Amelia in those pictures wasn't the woman I thought I knew. She was a stranger, someone who had replaced the person I'd spent a decade building a life with. When Amelia came home that night, I was sitting at the dining table, the folder open in front of me. She froze in the doorway, her keys jangling in her hand. "What's this?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Proof," I said, my voice steady but cold. "Of what you've been doing behind my back." Her eyes flicked to the photos, and for the first time, I saw her composure crack. Her face paled, and her hands trembled as she dropped her purse on the floor. "Ethan, I can explain," she stammered. "Can you?" I shot back, standing up so fast the chair screeched against the floor. "Because these pictures explain plenty. The hotel, his office, that parking lot. What more do I need to know?" She didn't answer right away, her lips pressing into a tight line. Then, almost defiantly, she said, "It's not what it looks like." I laughed bitterly, holding up the photo of her kissing Sinclair. "So you weren't doing this? Do you seriously think I'm that stupid, Amelia?" Her face flushed with anger now. "Fine. Yes. It happened. But it didn't mean anything." "It didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been sneaking around with him for weeks, maybe months, and you expect me to believe it didn't mean anything?" She crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "You don't understand. You never understand. Do you know how lonely I've been? How hard it's been to keep this marriage going while you sit back and wallow in self-pity?" Her words hit me like a slap. "Lonely?" I said, incredulous. "You're blaming me for this? For your decision to cheat?" "I'm not blaming you," she snapped. "I'm saying it's complicated. You don't make me feel wanted anymore, Ethan. I'm just a trophy wife to you, something to show off to your friends. Sinclair. He made me feel alive again." "Alive?" I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You think this is what being alive feels like? Lying? Sneaking around? Destroying the person who trusted you the most?" Amelia didn't respond. She just stood there, her expression unreadable, as if she didn't know whether to keep fighting or back down. Finally, I spoke, my voice quieter but no less firm. "I want you out of this house. Tonight." Her eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded, turned, and walked upstairs to pack. As the door slammed behind her an hour later, I sat back down at the dining table, staring at the photos. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I felt hollow. Amelia was gone, but the damage she'd done was here to stay. The silence in the house was suffocating after Amelia left. For the first few days, I went through the motions. Wake up, go to work, come home, eat something that barely passed for dinner, and stare at the walls until sleep finally came. The emptiness gnawed at me. Her things were still scattered throughout the house. Her favorite mug on the kitchen counter, a sweater draped over the couch, perfume lingering faintly in the bedroom. I wanted to throw it all out, but I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it. It felt like erasing her would erase the last 10 years of my life. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the questions that came with it. Had she ever really loved me? Was there something I could have done to stop this? Or had I just been fooling myself all along? On the third night after she left, I found myself staring at her wedding ring. She'd left it on the bathroom counter, right next to the sink. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal in my hand, and thought about the day I'd slid it onto her finger. I'd been so sure back then, so confident that she was the one. Now, that certainty was gone. I threw the ring into the back of a drawer and slammed it shut. A few days later, Amelia called. I wasn't ready to hear her voice, but I picked up anyway. "Ethan," she began, her tone careful, almost rehearsed. "I just wanted to see how you were doing." "How I'm doing?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "You're asking how I'm doing after you destroyed our marriage? After you walked out without a second thought?" She sighed. "I didn't destroy anything, Ethan. Things were broken long before Sinclair. You just never wanted to see it." I clenched the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Don't you dare try to rewrite this," I said, my voice low. "I would have done anything for you, Amelia. You were my wife, and you threw it all away for some cheap thrill." Her voice cracked. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" I snapped. "You made every choice, every lie, every step up those stairs with him. You don't get to play the victim now." There was a long silence on the other end before she spoke again, quieter this time. "I want to come by and pick up some things. Is that okay?" "Fine," I said shortly. "But I won't be here. Leave the key on the counter when you're done." The day Amelia came to collect her things, I made sure I was out of the house. I didn't want to see her. Instead, I went for a drive, letting the hum of the car engine and the blur of passing scenery calm my nerves. When I got back that evening, it was clear she'd been there. Her closet was half empty, the mug she always used was gone, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air. The wedding ring was missing from the drawer. But what struck me the most was the note she'd left on the dining table. "Ethan, I'm sorry for everything. I know that doesn't fix it, but I am. I hope someday you can understand. Amelia." I crumpled the note in my hand and tossed it into the trash. Sorry didn't even scratch the surface of what she'd done. Over the next week, the whispers started. Glenwood Prep was a small, tight-knit community, and word traveled fast. I overheard snippets of conversations in the hallways. Staff members speculating about Sinclair's sudden absences, parents gossiping about the fundraiser. I avoided the lounge, dodged questions from curious coworkers, and stuck to my classroom like it was a safe haven. But I knew it was only a matter of time before someone cornered me. That someone turned out to be Vanessa Chong, a fellow teacher and one of the few people I considered a friend. She caught me after class one afternoon, her brow furrowed with concern. "Ethan, can we talk?" she asked. I sighed, gesturing for her to sit at one of the desks. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I've been hearing some things about you and Amelia. About Sinclair." My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What have you heard?" "That she left," Vanessa said, her voice soft. "And that Sinclair might have had something to do with it." I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand over my face. "Yeah," I said finally. "That about sums it up." She frowned, her sympathy clear. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I had no idea things were like that." "Neither did I," admitted, my voice bitter. Vanessa reached out, placing a hand on my arm. "If you need anything, someone to talk to, a distraction, anything, just let me know, okay? You don't have to go through this alone. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than anger and pain. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, I sat down with a glass of whiskey and started making a list. A list of everything I'd lost, everything I wanted back, and everything I needed to do to rebuild my life. At the top of that list was one name: Gregory Sinclair. Because this wasn't just about Amelia anymore. This was about exposing the man who thought he could take what wasn't his and walk away unscathed. And I wasn't about to let that happen. The day after I made that list, something shifted in me. The shock and pain hadn't disappeared, but they'd hardened into resolve. Amelia's betrayal had broken me, but Sinclair's arrogance, his smug belief that he could walk into my life, ruin my marriage, and walk away untouched, that's what lit the fire. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The first thing I needed was information, and I knew exactly where to start. Amelia might have lied to me, but she wasn't careful enough to hide everything. That morning, I sat down with her old laptop, the one she hardly used since she'd upgraded to a tablet. She'd never been great with passwords, and after a few tries, I was in. The email account was full of work correspondence, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I found it, a folder labeled private. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside were dozens of emails, mostly from Sinclair. The tone shifted from professional to personal, then outright inappropriate. One subject line caught my eye. Next week, our secret getaway. I clicked it. Sinclair had booked a suite at a luxury hotel in the city under an alias, with a note confirming the reservation. The date matched one of Amelia's business trips. I kept digging, finding more damning evidence. Flirty exchanges, meeting details, even financial transactions that made no sense. It was clear that Sinclair wasn't just seducing Amelia. He was using his position to manipulate her. But there was something else. Buried in the emails were references to Glenwood Prep's financial dealings, donations that hadn't been accounted for, expenses that didn't match up. It wasn't enough to confirm anything illegal, but it was enough to make me suspicious. The next step was reaching out to someone who could help. I thought about Vanessa. She'd offered her support, but I wasn't sure how much I could trust her with something like this. Instead, I called an old college friend, Vanessa Chong, a real estate developer who'd seen her fair share of dirty deals. "Ethan," Vanessa said when she picked up, her voice bright. "It's been a while. What's going on?" "I need a favor," I said, cutting straight to the point. Vanessa didn't miss a beat. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that involves digging into someone's financials," I said. Discreetly. There was a pause on the other end. "You're not getting mixed up in anything illegal, are you?" "No," I assured her. "But someone else might be. I just need to confirm it." She sighed. "Send me what you have. I'll see what I can do." While Vanessa started digging, I began laying the groundwork for my plan. Sinclair had made a mistake when he underestimated me. He thought I was just a quiet, unassuming guy who'd fade into the background. He didn't know I had something he needed, the land I'd inherited from my father. That land was a thorn in Glenwood Prep's side. Their ambitious expansion project relied on acquiring it, but I'd been reluctant to sell. Now, it was my leverage. I reached out to the school's board, proposing a meeting to discuss terms for a potential sale. The board eagerly agreed, not realizing the trap I was setting. A week later, Vanessa called with an update. "You were right," she said. "There's something fishy going on with Sinclair. He's been funneling donations into a separate account, and it's not being reported to the board. There's also a series of payouts to a company that doesn't seem to exist." My stomach tightened. "Do you have proof?" "Enough to raise questions," Vanessa said. "But if you want to blow this wide open, you'll need more." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Sinclair wasn't just a cheater, he was corrupt. That night, I sat down and finalized the plan. It had 3 phases. 1. Expose Sinclair's corruption. Using Vanessa's information, I'd gather enough evidence to present to the board and, if necessary, the authorities. 2. Use the land as leverage. I'd offer the property on my terms, ensuring Sinclair would be forced to play by my rules, or lose everything. 3. Make Amelia face the consequences. She'd chosen Sinclair over me, and she'd live with that decision. When the dust settled, I'd make sure she knew exactly what she'd thrown away. The first phase required patience. I spent hours combing through emails, financial records, and public filings, piecing together a web of lies and embezzlement. It wasn't easy, but the more I uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Sinclair had been skimming funds for years, using his charm and influence to cover his tracks. He'd bribed inspectors, manipulated donors, and funneled money into shell companies. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. When I finally had enough evidence, I contacted a reporter from a local newspaper, a guy I trusted to handle the story carefully. I sent him the files anonymously, with a note explaining the situation. Once this breaks, I thought, Sinclair won't know what hit him. But I wasn't finished. The next phase of the plan would take things even further. It was time to use my leverage and force Sinclair into a corner he couldn't escape. And when it was over, he'd regret ever crossing me. The meeting with Glenwood Prep's board was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. I dressed carefully that day, not the usual worn suit I'd relied on for years, but something new. A crisp navy blazer, a tailored white shirt, and a tie that gave just enough color to stand out without being loud. If I was going to play in Sinclair's world, I had to look the part. As I drove to the meeting, I rehearsed my pitch in my head. The plan wasn't just about the land anymore. I needed to sell them on the idea that I was a team player, someone they could trust to help secure the future of the school. All the while, I knew I'd be slipping the noose around Sinclair's neck. The boardroom was as polished and pretentious as I expected. A long mahogany table stretched the length of the room, with a stunning view of the city skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. The board members were already seated, their expressions ranging from curious to mildly impatient. "Mr. Carter," one of them said as I entered, extending a hand. "We're so glad you're willing to discuss the property. It's an important piece of the puzzle for Glenwood's future." I shook his hand and gave a polite smile. "I'm glad we could arrange this meeting. I think you'll find my proposal mutually beneficial." The words tasted like sand, but I forced them out anyway. Sinclair was there, of course, sitting at the head of the table. His smirk was more restrained than usual, likely because the rumors of his impropriety had started circulating. I met his eyes briefly, letting him see the determination behind my calm demeanor. The presentation began smoothly. I outlined the benefits of the land's location and its potential to bolster Glenwood's campus expansion. I emphasized how it would serve the students, the community, and the school's reputation. "But," I said, pausing for effect, "there are conditions." The room grew quiet. Sinclair's smirk faltered, and I saw his eyes narrow. I handed out copies of the contract I'd drawn up. It was straightforward, on the surface. The school could have the land for a significantly reduced price, but only if the current administration oversaw the project's completion. If the administration failed to meet specific benchmarks, the property would revert to me. "It's about ensuring accountability," I explained, my voice steady. "This project has the potential to elevate Glenwood Prep to new heights. But it needs to be handled with the utmost care." The board murmured their approval, nodding as they scanned the terms. Sinclair, however, remained silent, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "I believe this agreement protects the school's interests while ensuring that the project stays on track," I added. One of the board members spoke up. "This is generous, Mr. Carter, and certainly well thought out. But what's driving this sudden willingness to sell? You've held onto this land for years." I glanced at Sinclair before answering. "Let's just say I've gained a new perspective recently. It's time to move forward." After the meeting, as the board members filed out, Sinclair approached me. His charm was still intact, but his eyes betrayed him. "Ethan," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder, "I have to admit, that was impressive. I didn't think you'd come around on selling the property." I shrugged off his hand. "I'm full of surprises." His smile tightened. "You're playing a dangerous game, Carter." "Funny," I said, meeting his gaze. "I was about to say the same thing to you." For a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw the frustration bubbling beneath his polished exterior. He knew I was up to something, but he didn't know what. "Good luck, Greg," I said, turning to leave. "You're going to need it." The next few days were a whirlwind. The story about Sinclair's financial misconduct broke in the local paper, complete with leaked documents and anonymous sources. It was front-page news, and the fallout was immediate. Parents demanded answers. Donors threatened to pull their funding. The board was forced to call an emergency meeting to address the scandal. I stayed out of the spotlight, watching from a distance as Sinclair's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. The turning point came a week later, during another board meeting. This time, I wasn't invited, but Vanessa was. She'd connected with a few sympathetic board members who were eager to hear more about Sinclair's activities. Vanessa presented a detailed report, outlining the missing funds and questionable transactions in meticulous detail. By the time she finished, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that Sinclair had been skimming from the school's budget for years. That evening, I got a call from Vanessa. "It's done," she said. "The board voted to suspend Sinclair indefinitely. They're launching a full investigation." I leaned back in my chair, a wave of satisfaction washing over me. "What about Amelia?" I asked. Vanessa hesitated. "She's been implicated. They're looking into her role in all this. She might not face legal trouble, but her reputation's taken a hit." When the dust settled, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, yes, but also a deep sense of loss. I'd won, but at what cost? My marriage was over. My trust in people had been shattered. But as I sat in the quiet of my home that night, I realized something else. I wasn't the same man I'd been before. I wasn't the passive bystander, the quiet husband who let things happen to him. I'd fought back. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own story. A week after Sinclair's suspension hit the headlines, Amelia showed up at the house unannounced. I was sitting in the living room, sorting through some paperwork, when I heard the knock at the door. I considered ignoring it, but something told me this wasn't a conversation I could avoid forever. When I opened the door, she stood there, clutching her handbag tightly. Her polished appearance was slightly off, her hair wasn't as neat, her makeup wasn't as flawless, and there was a nervous energy in the way she shifted her weight. "Ethan," she said softly, "can I come in?" I stepped aside without a word, leading her to the kitchen. She glanced around, her eyes landing briefly on the empty spot where her favorite mug used to sit. "I assume you've heard about Greg," she began, taking a seat at the table. I sat across from her, folding my arms. "Hard to miss. His face is all over the papers. You're lucky yours isn't." Her expression faltered. "I didn't know," she said, almost pleading. "I didn't know he was stealing money or—" "Spare me," I cut her off. "You didn't know about the money, maybe. But you knew what kind of man he was. You knew exactly what you were doing every time you met him in secret, every time you lied to my face." She flinched, looking down at her hands. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, leaning forward. "A mistake is forgetting to turn off the coffee pot. You had an affair, Amelia. You tore apart our marriage. That's not a mistake. It's a choice. 1,000 choices." Her eyes glistened, but I felt no sympathy. "Not this time." "Ethan, I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how it got this far. I was confused. Things between us hadn't been right for a long time." I barked out a bitter laugh. "And whose fault is that? You never talked to me about it. You just ran to Sinclair like he was some kind of solution. Was he worth it, Amelia? Was he worth throwing everything away?" She hesitated, and that pause was all the answer I needed. "I didn't come here to fight," she said quietly. "I came because I want to make things right." "Make things right?" I repeated, incredulous. "You think you can just apologize and we'll go back to how things were? That's not how this works. You can't undo what you've done." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. "I've been looking into therapists," she said. "I thought maybe we could try counseling. See if there's anything left to salvage." I didn't touch the envelope. "There's nothing left to salvage," I said bluntly. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. You chose him, Amelia," I said, my voice hard. "You made your bed, and now you get to lie in it. Alone." Her tears came then, silent but steady. She wiped her face quickly, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. "What about us?" she whispered. What about everything we built together? I shook my head. We didn't build anything together. I built this marriage while you tore it down piece by piece. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You're right, she said, her voice trembling with anger and pain. I messed up. But I loved you, Ethan. I still do. You don't destroy someone you love, I said quietly. She stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for something I couldn't give her. Finally, she picked up her bag and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back, her voice barely above a whisper. I hope someday you can forgive me. I didn't respond. The door clicked shut behind her, and I was alone again. Later that night, I found the envelope she'd left on the table. I opened it, expecting to find a list of therapists or some kind of apology letter. Instead, it was a check, $5,000. A note was attached. This is all I can afford to pay back right now. For everything I took from you. I'll send more when I can. I'm sorry. I stared at the check for a long time before tearing it in half. Forgiveness wasn't for sale, and it never would be. The days that followed felt lighter somehow. Amelia's visit had been like ripping off a bandage. Painful, but necessary. I didn't feel healed, but I felt like I could finally start moving forward. Sinclair was gone, Amelia was out of my life, and the path ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now. It took weeks for the chaos to settle, but life didn't stop to wait for me. The days were quieter now, though not exactly peaceful. I was still processing everything, Amelia's betrayal, Sinclair's downfall, and the pieces of my life that didn't seem to fit together anymore. But something shifted as the weeks turned into months. The house, once filled with her presence, started to feel like mine again. I rearranged the furniture, took down the framed photos of us, and packed away the memories that hurt too much to see. I painted the walls a fresh color and threw myself into the small, mindless tasks that reminded me I could rebuild. The school had moved on too, though Sinclair's shadow lingered in the whispers and the unease among staff and parents. The board hired an interim headmaster, someone steady and honest who started undoing the mess Sinclair had left behind. One afternoon, Vanessa stopped by my classroom. You're looking better, she said, leaning against the doorframe. I smiled faintly. Yeah, well, better is a low bar these days. She stepped inside, her usual confidence softened by concern. I heard from a board member that the property deal you structured helped keep the expansion project alive. That's no small thing, Ethan. Not sure it matters much now, I said, shrugging. The expansion isn't my problem anymore. Vanessa studied me for a moment before speaking again. You know, I think you're stronger than you realize. I wanted to brush it off, to tell her she didn't know what she was talking about, but something about her words stuck with me. A few weeks later, I found myself driving out to my family's land. It had been months since I'd visited, and the fields were overgrown, wildflowers spilling into the empty spaces where crops once grew. My dad used to tell me that this land was more than dirt and grass. He said it was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no matter what, life could grow back. I stood there for a long time, letting the stillness sink in. The weight of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the revenge, felt lighter here. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of an old wooden sign my father had carved when I was a kid. The paint was faded, but the words still stood out. Home is where you make it. I took those words to heart in the months that followed. I stopped looking backward and started thinking about what came next. I threw myself into teaching, rediscovering the joy of connecting with my students. Literature had always been my escape, my anchor, and now it became my way forward. I joined a local hiking group, started running in the mornings, and even took up woodworking, a hobby I'd always been too busy to try. And slowly, quietly, I started to heal. One evening, months later, Vanessa invited me to a small dinner at her place. It was nothing fancy, just a few friends, good food, and the kind of warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. As the night wound down, Vanessa sat beside me on her back porch, a glass of wine in her hand. You've come a long way, she said, smiling softly. I nodded, staring out at the stars. I didn't think I would. You deserve good things, Ethan, she said, her voice steady. Don't forget that. For the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her. Amelia tried reaching out a few more times. Emails, texts, even a letter. I didn't respond. It wasn't about bitterness anymore. It was about protecting my peace. I'd given her too much of my heart, my time, and my trust. Moving on meant letting go. 1 year after everything fell apart, I stood on my family's land again. This time, I wasn't alone. Vanessa was beside me, her hand resting lightly in mine as we watched the sun dip below the horizon. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. I shook my head. No, not anymore. I lost a lot, but maybe I needed to. Maybe it was the only way to find something better. She smiled, leaning into me. "You're tougher than you think, Ethan Carter." Maybe she was right. I wasn't the same man who had walked into that fundraiser, unsure of himself and blind to the storm brewing in his life. I was someone new, someone stronger. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole.